Dear listeners, we begin a new series on the Vedas in English, and we'll base our talks on this new book, Veda Vihangam. So, I don't know if you're getting it in reverse, Veda Vihangam. English subtitle is The Essential Veda. So, we will be covering the main aspects of the Vedas, what the Vedas are, and how they came into being, and how spiritual they are, what are their contents, and then selection from the Vedas to give you a fair idea about what they contain, which will include the ideas of creation, gods, prayer to gods, and other things. So we begin with my humblest and deepest pranams to the sages who gave us the Vedas, to God who keeps on appearing amidst humanity in various incarnations, and He, when He incarnates, shows how the Vedas are the ultimate truth. When God came as Sri Ramakrishna, He showed the world how one can attain spiritual wisdom as recorded in the Vedas directly. So, two things that He showed. First, spirituality is a very real thing, and secondly, the Vedas are absolutely the real thing. So, with my humblest pranams at the holy feet of all these great sages and incarnations, I begin this series of talks with a prayer that comes from the Vedas itself. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om. This prayer is meant for kind of synthesis, harmony between the teacher and the students. We will be explaining this and the other Shanti mantras as and when they come in this series. So, those of you who might have listened to our Bengali series of talks on the Vedas, you'd be familiar with lots of information that we would be giving you. And we also had discussed the Vedas in a series of talks named Hinduism. There, I think there are 6 or 7 talks on the Vedas, but that doesn't give you a complete picture of the Vedas. So, our head here at the university, Srimad Swami Atmapriyanji Maharaj, he wanted that we have a complete series of talks in English on the Vedas, and people are quite eager to know what exactly the Vedas are about. So, based on the talks that we had delivered on YouTube, as also in the offline classes, I wrote this book, Veda Vihangam. And now it has become pretty easy for people to read directly and for us to deliver these talks. So, with that, we begin. And those of you who have listened to these talks in the past might find some of these ideas repetitive. But when we are passing on the information, naturally, those will be repeated. Now, imagine yourself becoming spiritual. When you become spiritual, it means that you have turned your attention from the external to the internal. From the external to the internal means that in reality you are spirit, Atman. But for whatever reason, you, that includes me, are in this world exploring the beauties of this nature. And when you explore the beauties of this nature, naturally you will have to pay the price for it. The price for seeing those sights. First is entrapment, slavery, and second is tears. And when you have shed enough of tears, when you say, had enough of pain, you move on. New sights greet you. You feel that you will be comfortable here, and once again you have to pay the same price. And then you move on. And this kind of journey continues from birth to birth, and practically for eternity, till you say enough, no more. And you say, I want to be spiritual. So what were you till now? You were spiritual only. You were on a journey. Like supposing I'm sitting here in Kolkata and you want to travel to Delhi. I take a train, and when I take a train, I keep on passing through various stations, and each of those stations, they have different sites to offer, just like that. But nevertheless, whatever the site, you are moving towards destination. So entire creation is moving towards perfection. That is self-realization, knowledge that they are Atman. However, when we travel, some travel slowly, some travel fast. But when you say that, no, I want only to be spiritual, so you have to sit down, calm down your external limbs, that is, external senses, and then try to focus your mind away from even the internal senses. Normally in English, they say five senses and five limbs, but in the Indian tradition, they are all known as indriyas. Now, as you start focusing your mind, like you might focus on some external object and imagine it, or your teacher, spiritual teacher, may give you some mantra, some spiritual ideal to focus upon, and then you center all your activities. Now, mind you, that's very important. Those of you who want to practice meditation, those of you who want to practice yoga, the first condition for that is you must restrain yourself from going all out in the world. That means your enjoyments, your interactions, your involvement, they must be curved, and curved very heavily. If you don't, your head will go wrong. Believe me that your head will go wrong. Right? I'm in an organization where spirituality is absolutely fresh, because Sri Ramakrishna was here just 100, years ago. So spirituality is in its freshest form. And naturally, it's attracting hundreds and thousands of spiritual persons, or rather those who are interested in spirituality. And we know how they grow, how they falter, how they succeed. So what I am telling is from direct experience. It's not just some kind of imagination or just seeing one or two examples. So as you control your limbs and start controlling your senses, slowly you realize that the external world that you had been experiencing is not really as real as you had been imagining. That means the hold of the world on you starts diminishing. And as the hold of the world starts diminishing on you, you start growing spiritual in the true sense of the word. And if you are lucky enough, indeed, if you are lucky enough, you can experience things which would be absolutely beyond your imagination. The kind of experiences you will have can be categorized into four. First is the world that you had been experiencing. It's known as physical world, sthul jagat. And when you truly start experiencing the inner world, which is not imagining, I'm using the word experiencing. This is known as subtle world, the world of gods, the world of angels, and the world of demigods, semigods, etc. But That's not enough. When your meditation becomes much more intense, when you really go very, very, very deep, the way you gave up the physical world, just like that, you will give up the subtle world. And then you will be face to face with God. Face to face, but you will not be able to experience Him directly. There will be some kind of, you can say, invisible wall. And if you persist, or if God wants, you can break that glass wall. And once you break that glass wall, what happens? No one knows. No one knows. Because what happens is not the object, not an object of knowledge. There you don't know anything. You become one with it. And perchance, if you return from that state, it's not the experience of that state you return with, it's the experience of just the coming out, the border, which was when you were face to face with God. So, this third one is known as causal world. The fourth one is not a world, but is a state known as Mahakaran. Now, if you talk about a complete book, a thorough book, it must describe the physical world, the subtle world, the causal world, and Mahakaran, the substratum. When you look at this, the books that have been written by the greats, like books by the great literary persons, books by the scientists, they all describe the physical world in various ways. And some of the scriptures, particularly our Puranas and books in other religions too, they describe the subtle world, the world of gods, etc. And most scriptures are based on the causal world. When you are face to face with God, there God may talk to you, God may show you different kind of spiritual experiences, etc. And the fourth one, which you find only in the Upanishads, a bit in the Vedas, and Upanishads are of course the part of the Vedas only, and in the words of some great mystics from other religions. The problem with most of the other religions is that they don't like to talk about oneness with God. And because they don't talk about oneness with God, they have not emphasized on it because that idea goes against their certain theology. Anyway, that's not our concern. The Vedas are the complete book. They talk about how to succeed in the physical world. They describe a lot the happenings at the subtle world. In fact, the description of the subtle world is so huge, like gods and goddesses, etc., so huge that Hindu religion seems to get lost in that. And they discuss the causal world, where they're seeing the great God. And of course, the speciality of Hindu religion, where you talk about oneness with God, that is the essence of the Vedas. But as we shall see, that particular knowledge was kept reserved for the truly spiritual greats, not for the ordinary people who were just kind of dabbling in spirituality. Who exactly wrote the Vedas and how these were written? So for that you have to go back something like 10,000 years in history. The modern historians colored extreme hugely by the Western mindset and communist mindset. They will try to put this Vedic period to say maybe 3,500 years or 4,000 years ago, but that's not the fact. So it has to be 10,000 years. There are many reasons why we believe that way. That's not our concern. That's what the historians discuss, and it's their domain. So there lived a race who came to be known as the Arya, not to be confused with the Arya word used by Hitler. Arya means those whose tastes are refined, whose culture is refined. Very often you will find people condemning Hindu religion for discriminating. Hindu religion doesn't discriminate the way other religions discriminate. For example, other religions will say, follow our words or else you go to the hell. But that's not what Hinduism says. Hindu religion will say, be culturally refined. Till you are not culturally refined, keep doing your duty and follow the practices of the culturally great. Finished. Nothing more. One or two instances of this and that, which people keep on quoting when they have to criticize Hindu religion. That's not important. Now, these Aryans who are believed to have lived on the banks of Indus, now we don't know much about it because history is yet to reach there. So these people, they loved life. They really loved life. They ate well, slept well, had plenty of wine, enjoyed life in every possible way. And they also wanted to go to the heaven, and they practiced religion for that. And amongst them were some who, instead of running after the worldly pleasures, focus their attention, focus their mind on the inner world. This journey from the external to internal is possible generally only when you have a full belly. If you are struggling for your existence, I mean, not an individual, I mean the entire society. Only when a society has a full belly and maybe a place to sleep and a cot to sleep, that it can think of art, it can think of literature, it can think of higher things, and it can think of religion. These Aryans, they had a full belly and they had a cot to sleep and they enjoyed. So some of these culturally refined, they went into exploring the inner world. And depending on how intense their meditation was, they found out the reality that was behind this physical world. The gods, the goddesses, and the supreme God. And what lay beyond the glass ceiling. The knowledge that they acquired, they preserved. They preserved by passing it on to their disciples or to their children. But they never claimed that this knowledge was theirs. In the sense that, see, when a poet writes something, like we know that Iliad and Odyssey were written by Homer. Surprisingly, the story of Iliad and Odyssey was a household name. Homer just gave a proper presentation of that story. But now the story is credited to Homer. These sages, they discovered certain spiritual truths. We really do not know who exactly found those truths, because the names that come in the Vedas, maybe the name of the sage who discovered that knowledge, or maybe that may be the family name. But The bottom line is that those sages and the families that they maintain that knowledge, and even today, we say that these sages only discovered that knowledge. When we say discover that knowledge, we basically mean to say that, like, there is, say, law of gravitation, and we say that it's Newton's laws of gravitation. It cannot be Newton's laws of gravitation or Newton's laws of motion. These are the nature's laws discovered by Newton. Now, sages were not keen to have their name the way Newton was. Newton was actually extremely keen to have his name. That's the irony of a great scientist. So, the knowledge that these sages acquired came to be known as apaurushaya, impersonal. And by saying that it is impersonal, they mean to say that not only them, or not only he, not only she, but anyone in this world located anywhere in geography or in history or in future can have a direct experience of that knowledge. That means I can have the experience of that knowledge. You can have the experience of that knowledge. Anyone can have anywhere in America, in England, in Europe, in Africa, anywhere. That's something unusual about Hindu religion. It's not confined in geography, in history, or in anything, neither in time, nor in place, nor in person. It says that these are universal knowledge, and that's why it's known as Sanatan Dharma. To give you two very interesting examples, and these are my very favorite ones. Sri Ramakrishna once went to meet Devendranath Tagore, who was a very famous person in those days, father of Rabindranath Tagore. And Sri Ramakrishna asked him to say something about something from the Vedas. And then Rabindranath Tagore quoted from the Upanishads, which meant that this whole universe is like a chandelier, God is like a chandelier, and each individual is like a small lamp. And later Sri Ramakrishna, whom we worship as incarnation of God, and who lived the life of a devotee, and that way he showed how to live in this world, live like a devotee. So he said later that I had exact vision of what Devendranath Tagore described. And I felt, oh, what a great person he is. So Devendranath Tagore knows about this particular spiritual vision. Sri Ramakrishna considers him great. And yet Sri Ramakrishna himself had experienced that. That means the description that comes in the Upanishad about God and his relation to this, the individual souls, it's not something coming as a poetry. And it's not something coming as a unique experience by some sage in the past. It's a living knowledge. Anybody can experience it. And anyone who experiences it will become blessed because he can put this knowledge into practice, into daily life. Once you realize that this is the reality behind this universe, naturally your life will change and will change forever. Similarly, Sri Ramakrishna's great disciple, Swami Vivekananda, was once traveling through India and he reached Punjab. He reached banks of Indus, where the story of the Vedas begin. And once in a divine vision, it was a kind of a divine vision in the sense that when the visions are divine, unless they are kind of ghostly. So He saw that suddenly there was fog and waves of fog, and there was an ancient sage sitting on the banks of the Indus and chanting Saraswati mantra, Aya, Gayatri mantra, Aya Yi Varade Devi. It's generally used for Saraswati. And kind of indicated Swami Vivekananda to chant. And Swami Vivekananda kept on chanting. And then later on, he was to say that the intonation was different. And from there, he said that the Vedas are the national cadence, national rhythm of India. And he was to further say that Shankaracharya must have had an experience like this. And his entire work, Shankaracharya's work, is about the cadence that one finds in the Vedas. That is a reality of Sthul Jagat, Sukshma Jagat, Karan Jagat, and Mahakaran. That means reality as a whole. So, as in science, you find that this knowledge, the national cadence of India, which is the Vedas, is corpus of spiritual knowledge, just like science. Like sometimes people say, who founded Hindu religion? It's like asking who founded science. So the way science, the contributions have been made in science by hundreds and thousands of great scientists. Contributions in the corpus of spiritual knowledge, now known as the Vedas, was made by literally hundreds of sages whose names have come down to us. And there might have been many more whose names have been lost and whose contribution may not have been recorded, but on which systems were developed. So it says that in the Vedas we come across more than 300 names of these sages. And in that, we have 27 rishikas. Rishikas means female sages. And one charge against Hindu religion is that it discriminates against women. Think of 8,000 years, 10,000 years back in the history. Where was America? Where was Europe? What was Greece doing in those days? What was Rome doing in those days? Just imagine. England, which maybe 100 years ago or so, it was a leader of the entire, king of the entire world, where the sun did not set in its empire. There was always sun. People of England, UK, they were living in the trees and painting themselves red and blue. Just imagine 10,000 years. Even if you make it 5,000 years, 4,000 years, just imagine what was the world history then. And our females, the great females, they were contributing to the corpus of the Vedic knowledge. And as we will see, some of these contributions by these female sages known as Rishikas, they're just great, too great. And it's only because of them that we have these universal mantras like Gāyatrī mantra, Bhur-Bhuva Swat Savitur Varenyam. We will explain that. And the great national rhythm, the great rhythm that defines Hindu religion, Ekam Sadvipra Bodha Vadanti. Spiritual reality is one. It has many faces because spiritual truth is infinite, God is infinite, and infinite cannot be confined in a scripture. So in case of Abrahamic religions, those of you who know something about Abrahamic religion would know that they'll say that only their book is true, only their prophet is true. So for us, such an idea is preposterous. That's the only word we can say. Because for us, God is infinite. If God is infinite, his visions will be infinite. As many minds, so many gods. As many minds, so many versions of God. And naturally the descriptions that would be there in these scriptures would be of infinite variety. And that's what we will see in the Vedas. And that's where lies the specialty of the Vedas. And we have this famous mantra, Ekam Sadvipra Bodha Vadanti. Now, who or how these truths were converted into poetry form, we don't know. But in most cases, what we get in the Vedas are in poetic form. Sometimes we do come across some prose, but mostly they are in poetry form because it was easy to memorize them. Now, when these were of one sentence, one line, these were and these are known as mantras. This is a very important thing. Very often people call them shlokas or verses. No, no, that's wrong. The content of the Vedas, when of single line, should be addressed as mantras. And when there was this collection of many mantras, they were known as suktas, hymns. So there are hymns and mantras, suktas and mantras. As we mentioned, is the corpus of spiritual knowledge. If we say only spiritual knowledge, that's not correct because we also come across some of those simpler things of life, like how to woo a woman, how to get rid of jaundice, etc. We will mention these things. So they believe that this was corpus of complete knowledge. And knowledge, the Sanskrit word for knowledge comes from the root vidya. And from that it becomes Veda, the corpus of knowledge. It comes from the root vid, to know. Totality of knowledge came to be known as the Ved knowledge. The knowledge, the Ved, it was maintained by Brahmin families because that made things easier and simpler. These Brahmins were expected to live a very simple life, not, not to engage in any kind of luxuries, pleasure seeking, etc. In Manusmriti, in books like Manusmriti, we come across what the ideal life of a Brahmin should be. It's pretty difficult. When in modern times we come across people criticizing Brahmins, they forget that Brahmins were living the life of knowledge and renunciation, totally dedicated to knowledge and totally dedicated to giving up. And actually, they demanded privileges because when you give up, for example, military persons, those who are guarding our boundaries, borders, they are ready to give up their life for their motherland. And actually, they demand certain privileges. They want that their family should be looked after once they die and other things. Just like that, Brahmins demanded that they have certain privileges, and these privileges were not great. They just wanted their purity to be maintained. Finished. As a consequence, this corpus of knowledge has come down to us exactly the way they were composed and practically the way they were pronounced in an unbroken chain of Guru Shishya Sampradaya, teacher student tradition. A teacher had students and he passed on his complete knowledge, total knowledge. And the students memorized that entire knowledge exactly the way they were, even if they did not understand, because the general idea about the Vedas and about, say, the Brahmins was maintain the knowledge, just maintain the knowledge, even if you do not understand, because a time will come when the right person will come, and when that right person comes, he should get that knowledge and he will take it forward. Think of Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda was born as Narendranath Datta. His father was just an usual advocate. His mother was just a homemaker. Nowadays we call it homemaker, housewife. Now Swamiji's mom, She knew about spiritual traditions and she had narrated these stories to the young Naren. And because that knowledge was already there, prevalent in the society, the way it was, say, thousands of years ago, with some additions, alterations, young Naren, who was a spiritual genius, he went all out in search of true spirituality. And what happened after that is spiritual history. Sri Ramakrishna and his disciple Swami Vivekananda gave a complete new life to Hindu religion. Well, that's a different topic. So, with time, this knowledge grew to, you can say, unmanageable proportions. And worse, there was this fear of knowledge getting lost if a particular family, because these were maintained by families, and not every family knew about all the Vedas. And then came a real genius, the great Vyasa, and also known as Veda Vyasa. He was a spiritual genius and he could synthesize things and he could classify. And this is very unusual. That you're a spiritual genius. For example, Sri Ramakrishna was a spiritual genius. And Sri Ramakrishna taught us the synthesis of religion at a deeper level. But Sri Ramakrishna was not a classifier. Swami Vivekananda was not a classifier. Vyasa was a classifier. What he did was his reputation was so high. He was the son of great sage Parashar. Let's say long story about Vyasa. So he collected all the available material on the Vedas, on the Veda, and he organized them into the four. When he organized it, he made a very simple methodology. There are particular chants known as Rik. He kept them all into one book named Rig Ved. And there were some of these mantras of the Rig Ved which were to be used in certain yagyas, certain sacrifices, and they could be sung on veena, the musical instrument. That he put in another Ved known as Sāma Ved. And all the mantras that were required for pouring oblations in yajna, we'll explain yajna, they are put in Yajuḥ Ved. And whatever remained, that means all the material that could not be used directly in a yajna were put into the fourth known as Atharva Ved, and they are chanda, they are special kind of meter known as chanda. So Rig Veda are known as Rik, Yajuḥ Veda content are known as Yajuḥ or Yajus, and Sāma Veda are known as Saman. So this is all about division of the four Vedas. That which was a complete knowledge known as Ved was now classified and organized with a particular aim, with a very particular aim. And what I'm narrating here is the simplest possible form. If you go into the study of the Vedas and how they were organized and what are the methodologies, it's a huge subject. It's a huge subject. Rig Veda, which is considered the most fascinating and interesting because it contains the prayers to gods and goddesses. Rig Veda has 1028 hymns, suktas, as we mentioned, with 10,462 richas, that is mantras. So these are considered extremely sacred. Rig Veda is considered to be extremely sacred. And those of you who are from South India, you know that there are many families in South India where Kids are expected to memorize the whole of Rig Veda. We here at the Ramakrishna Mission have monks who memorized entire Rig Veda when they were kids. I know we have these monks. Then there was that famous communist leader, EMS Nambudripad. He had the Vedas. He had memorized the entire Vedas in his family tradition. Later on, of course, he would say that was the greatest waste of his time, of his life. Now, Samved has 1875 verses. I'm just giving numbers. And Yajurved has 1975 verses. And they are organized in various chapters. And Atharva Ved is pretty large compared to Yajurved and Samved, but not as large as Rig Ved. It has 5987 verses, organizing 20 chapters, 20 books, you can say, kandas. And Atharvaved is in 731 hymns. So that's the content of these four Vedas. As we mentioned just now, that when Vyasa organized it, he had a particular purpose here in mind, and it was Yajna. Yajna is, we'll be discussing some of these Yajnas, and Yajnas were performed by the priests who were essentially Brahmins. Fire would be lit, and there was an elaborate process for this god and that goddesses like that. And there would be Yajman. Yajman means householder who wanted a yajna to be performed. And these yajnas could be for anything, for acquiring wealth or just to show off your wealth, to get a son, to kill your enemies, etc. For everything, you name the thing, and there is a yajna for that. And usually there used to be three priests, one from the Rig Veda, one from the Samved, and one from the Yajurved. And the Brahmin coming from Atharva Veda tradition, he was supposed to know all the three Vedas, and he used to supervise the entire thing. In this, the Brahmin coming from Rig Veda tradition would chant the mantras, and the Brahmin from the Samveda, he would chant from the Samveda, and the person from the Yajurved tradition, he would pour the oblations, and he would keep on chanting from Yajurved. So, these offerings generally were put in fire. It was believed that the fire god known as Agni, in fact, the first hymn in the Rig Veda, it's dedicated to Agni, the fire god. You needed three very important things. First was, it must be performed perfectly. Even today, when they say that a yajna is to be performed, it has to perform perfectly. That means timing should be correct, place should be correct, etc. And the mantras have to be pronounced absolutely correctly. And the priest must have immaculate purity. All this makes for a very tall order, very tall order. And the three Vedas, that is Rig Veda, Samved, and Yajurved, they only had mantras. But to perform a yajna, you needed elaborate rituals, and there had to be a manual. The manual, the elaboration of those rituals. So these came to be known as Brahmana, not to be confused with Brahmin, the Varna, the caste. These are the books which come along with the main Vedas. And to distinguish between these two, the Vedas came to be known either as mantras or as Sangita. These are technical names. And elaboration of rituals came to be known as Brahmana. So there were mantra and Brahman. And later, Brahmins, that means the Vedic scholars, they said that only mantra and Brahmana, these are the Vedas. But With each Ved, there is appended Aranyak. In Aranyak, we find that speculations regarding nature of consciousness, Atman, it begins. And then there are Upanishads. Upanishads, the science of freedom. That gives us the knowledge of Atman. So these four things, Sangita portion, that is mantra, Brahman portion, Aranyak portion, and Upanishad portions. These four constitute a complete Ved. So when we say Rig Ved will be associated with certain Brahman, Aranyak, and Upanishads. We'll be discussing these. Now, along with each of these Vedas, there were 6 auxiliary subjects of studies. They were known as Vedanga. Shiksha. Shiksha was this art of pronunciation, how to pronounce. In the Vedas, Shiksha plays a very important role. Pronunciation plays a very important role. And then there was Vyakaran, grammar. And there was chant, prosody, poetic, about knowledge about poetic meters. And there was Nirukta. Nirukta is etymology, the explanation of certain words. And there was Jyotis, about astronomy. When to perform which yajna. Now, unless you know astronomy, it's very difficult to perform yajna. Now, this astronomy is not to be confused with astrology. Although Jyotish is generally translated as astrology, but it was more of astronomy. And Kalpa is about how to perform a yajna, manual for performance of yajnas. So this, in very brief, gives us some ideas about what Ved means and how the Ved was organized into the 4 Vedas. And we also mentioned how Vyasa organized the entire thing. And once he organized the entire thing, he gave the responsibility of maintaining the Vedas to 4 of his disciples. He gave Rig Ved to his famous disciple Paila. His name was Paila, just a name. Sam Veda to Jaimini, and Yajuḥ Ved to Vaishampayan, and Atharva Ved to Sumanta. These are 4 great sages were disciples of Vyasa. And Vaishampayan had a prodigious disciple named Yagyavalkya, very famous name. As the time passed, there was a quarrel between Guru and disciple, Vaishampayan and Yagyavalkya. And Vaishampayan was angry for some reason. And he asked Yagyavalkya to return all that he had learned. And Yagyavalkya was so furious, he said, I don't want a teacher like you. And he vomited out all his knowledge. These are stories to narrate certain things. And Yagyavalkya said, I don't want any human teacher now. He went, sat for meditation, prayed to Sun God. And Sun God once again gave the knowledge of Veda to Yagyavalkya. So we mentioned how Vedas are considered to be apaurushaya. Because the 4 Vedas, these are not treated as products of human mind. These are considered to be storehouse of spiritual knowledge, the way science is. And for the very orthodox, when God creates, he lets out this, you can say, laws of nature, the spiritual truths. And the whole of universe, the physical world, the subtle world, the causal world, and God himself. There's a particular pattern. There are laws of nature. These are laws of nature only, just that these are higher nature. not the nature that's discussed by science. Because these spiritual truths come from God directly, they are known as apaurushaya. From the word purus, purus means man. That is human intervention. There is no human intervention. Now, there is a very important thing to know about these Vedas, that although these are the four Vedas are corpus of knowledge, particularly spiritual knowledge, because Shankaracharya insisted on telling that only the spiritual knowledge coming from the Vedas are to be trusted. Because whatever they talk about, say, the physical world, if it gets contradicted by our present day knowledge, then the Vedas are not to be taken as true. More importantly, we find in the Vedas Arthavad. There is an expression Arthavad, which means praise. Vedas are lot full of Arthavad. They will be praising this God and that God because this God is going to give you this God is going to give you this, and you are going to this heaven, you are going to that heaven. So whenever they talk about heaven, etc., we don't know whether they mean actual heaven or they mean just praise. Because the purpose of the Vedas is just one, to make a person's mind turn towards God, to be spiritual, to move away from this world, to move away from the pleasures of this world and grow inward. And second thing is Namadheya. This is a technical, it means categorizing and listing of gods. So you have gods and you have anti-gods and people, etc. These lists are not to be taken very seriously because, for example, when you study science, sometimes you study this story and that story related to science, but that doesn't make the real science. And the third is known as stuti, praise. It's because these things are, this praise, they are required to take people out from their narrow understanding of things. So they will say that sometimes they will say that if you do not do this, you will go to hell. The idea is to say that don't do bad things, be good. So with these things clear that there is Arthavad, there is Namdeya, there is Stuti, and the Vedas are about spiritual knowledge. We shouldn't even look at the temporal things, the worldly things that are mentioned there. We should focus more on the spiritual aspect of the Vedas, which are the real purpose of the Vedas. So, very important thing is that whatever the knowledge that they give, they're not hidebound. Hidebound is absolute. They say that, okay, fine, you got your knowledge, fair enough, go ahead. And in case of say Christianity, Bible is hidebound. Nobody can change it. Even if you have some spiritual experience and you know it to be true, but if it's not there in the Bible and say different scripture for different religions, you will not be accepted as true. That doesn't happen in India. In Hinduism, they say that the knowledge contained in the Vedas are supreme, in the sense that you have to see whether or not there is some kind of continuity. You may have your knowledge, nothing wrong with it, but it should not contradict the general idea that we already find in the Vedas. In total, if you take all the Vedas together, we have roughly 90,000 lines. 90,000 lines is a huge volume. And this had to be maintained by the disciples of Vyasa and the great disciples. So they developed different techniques. And even today, when we have the Vedic mantras recited, you might have noticed, like when we were reciting Om Sahana Vavatu. So there are three notes used: the lower, the flat, and the higher. And they say that in ancient times, their meaning changed depending on how you pronounce it. Something like we have in Indian languages, Harswa and Dirgha. So their meaning changes just like that. Now, surprisingly, these Brahmin families, they maintained this entire Vedic knowledge just by oral tradition. So they had Padapart and they had this Sangita part, Anukramanika, etc., etc. Now, in 1860s, 70s, when Max Muller was collecting this corpus of the Vedas and trying to translate them, he had some scholars employed, and these books were being printed at the Oxford or maybe in London. And there were scholars, Sanskrit scholars coming from South India, who were students of Max Muller for various reasons. And these students, they knew the Vedas by heart. And Max Muller describes how when the proof used to come from the press, these students would just look at the printed form and point out the mistakes without without comparing it with the manuscript. The entire thing was there in the head. And we have monks in the Ramakrishna mission who I have seen. They can just if you just show them something, they will instantly say that here intonation is wrong, here this thing is wrong, like that. But the kind of Sanskrit that was used in the corpus of the Vedas, it kind of became obsolete long ago, very long ago, very long ago. So there was one great Vedic scholar, Yask, way back something like 700 BC. That means roughly 2800 or maybe 3000 years ago. So he wrote a Nirukta where he explained the meaning of the words because things were getting lost. And then, of course, we had Sayanacharya in 13th CE, that is roughly 800 years ago. He wrote his commentary on the Rig Veda, and that saved the Vedas. Now, without Sayanacharya, it is impossible for us to know what the mantras mean. There have been great scholars like Sri Aurobindo. He also explained some of the things, not the entire thing. So we owe hugely to Sayanacharya who explained the Vedas for us. And there have been some other commentators, but Sayanacharya is the most famous. So there's the very short narration of the Vedas, and we'll be discussing its content as also the background and how things are related with each other as we progress. But one thing is very important that we all should know that if India has any respect today, is because of the Vedas. Whatever we find in the Indian tradition, anything noble, it comes from the Vedas. The mantras used in the marriage ceremony comes from the Vedas. Some of the mantras that are used, say, during cremation, they come from the Vedas. In the last rites of the departed, Shraddha, etc., they are used from the Vedas. Geometry came from the Vedas because they used to make different kinds of arrangements during yajna. Poetry got its shape because of the Vedas. Sanskrit language itself and Sanskrit literature owes hugely to the Vedas. You name the thing in the Indian psyche, Practically everything that is noble in the Indian tradition, like for example, not only geometry, but Vedic mathematics, astronomy, astrology, everything goes to the Vedas. So when you think of the culture of the Hindus, know that it is coming from the Vedas. So India was a geographical mass, a land mass. It became a spiritual country and it got its soul entirely because of the Vedas. In our next talks, we shall be trying to feel this soul. Now, when we talk about Upanishads and now people have started talking about I am Brahman, etc., all these things have their roots in the Vedas. So we will see more of it as time passes. Thank you so much for being with us. Join us in this talk next Friday. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om.